America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse.
In 1971, President Richard Nixon declared the war on drugs.
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive.
Promising to remove substance abuse from American society. But over 50 years later, the war rages on, with devastating consequences. The war on drugs destroyed the lives of millions of innocent people, has led to an enormous explosion of incarceration rates, and has even brought an entire nation to its knees. The US government has spent billions of dollars on waging the war, but it seems the world today is not a step closer to being free of drugs. So this led me to the following question. Has the war on drugs achieved its goals, or has it created more problems than it solved? In the late 60s, the USA saw a significant increase of drug use in major cities. The president of that time, President Nixon, used this as a reason to wage war against drugs and criminals.
I have asked the Congress to provide the legislative authority and the funds to fuel this kind of an offensive. With regard to this offensive, it is necessary first to have a new organization.
And in 1973, the Drug Enforcement Administration was established. The 1970s and the 1980s saw a rise in drug trafficking coming from Latin America, particularly cocaine from Colombia, leading the DEA to target major organizations like the Medellin and Cali cartel. Most of the cocaine that was smuggled into the US came from the Medellin cartel, ran by this guy, Pablo Escobar, the most notorious drug lord of that time. Over the years, the war transformed into something new entirely. The Colombian cartel ramped up their cocaine trade, and the USA wasn't doing any better. Drug-related crime was ever on the rise, and the US government was no step closer to winning the war on drugs. And in the 80s, two new government acts were introduced that would turn out to be disastrous for communities of color. In 1984 and 1986, President Ronald Reagan introduced the Comprehensive Crime Control Act and the Anti-Drug Abuse Act.
And I want to announce this program today. It is one that outlines a national strategy that I believe will bring us very close to removing a stain from American history that has lasted nearly 100 years.
These acts increased the penalties for cannabis possession, introduced mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenses, and hardened the penalties for crack, but not for cocaine or crystal meth. The federal annual budget for drug enforcement went from 8 million to 95 million. All of this combined led to the highest incarceration rates yet. In fact, the state prison population for non-violent drug offenses would rise with more than 1,200% in the coming 20 years. My initial thought was, good, if more criminals are arrested, then there will be less crime. However, a lot of the people that were arrested were not exactly criminals. Yes, they used drugs, but they did not do anything illegal that could harm someone else. Most of them were also a victim of addiction, and instead of helping them, they were imprisoned for years. And when they finally would get out, they wouldn't be able to find work or get a loan from a bank because of their criminal records. This only further increased the risk of them relapsing and going back to using drugs. And under the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, the penalties for crack cocaine offenses were much harsher than those for powder cocaine. This led to unfair long sentences for individuals caught with even a small amount of crack. Specifically, the law established a 100 to 1 sentencing difference between crack and powder cocaine. This meant that the possession of 5 grams of crack carried the same mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years in federal prison as possession of 500 grams of powder cocaine.
The single greatest scourge has been the introduction of an old drug in a new and more dangerous form, crack cocaine.
Crack was often cheaper and more accessible than cocaine, making it more prevalent in low-income communities, which were sadly disproportionately Black. Law enforcement explicitly targeted Black communities in drug enforcement efforts, focusing on crack, which was more common in these communities. This led to a higher rate of arrest and convictions for crack offenses among people of color. The war on drugs era of the 1980s was characterized by the tough on crime policies and a focus on punitive measures rather than treatment and rehabilitation. While the intent of the law may have been to target drug dealers, the mandatory minimum sentences often ensnared low-level users and addicts, trapping them in a cycle of incarceration and poverty. Meanwhile, the DEA and Colombian government started to crack down on Pablo Escobar's empire. Eventually, Pablo Escobar finally surrendered to the Colombian government on the terms that he could sit out his prison sentence in a prison of his own design. He basically lived in a small private paradise where he would go on to rule his empire from. The Colombian government could not let this slide, and they tried to relocate him to a real prison. But Pablo escaped, and sure enough, more chaos ensued. Eventually, the Colombian government killed Pablo Escobar, and the Medellin cartel disbanded. Now this might sound as a victory in the war on drugs, but in reality it didn't really make a difference. Other criminal organizations like the Cali cartel quickly filled in the void the Medellin cartel left, and the cocaine trade was barely interrupted. It was, however, a huge victory for Colombia. The defeat of Pablo showed the world that the drug lords were not invincible, and back in the United States, some things did start to improve. In the late 80s, the first drug court opened its doors in Miami. A drug court is a special court that helps non-violent drug offenders by focusing on treatment and rehabilitation instead of jail time. Its main goal is to reduce repeat offenses. The success of the first drug court in Miami became noticeable in the early 90s. Drug court participants were much less likely to commit new crimes than those who went through the regular court system. And in the end, the drug court proved to be more cost effective than imprisonment, saving money for the justice system and in turn for the taxpayers. And finally, things started to look better. The numbers of crack and cocaine addictions were gradually on the decline. Until
opioid addiction has reached crisis levels across the nation, including the local community.
The Naperville Police Department and local addiction treatment providers together to talk about the opioid crisis.
Overdosing on opioids.
Fentanyl is the driving cause of all these overdoses.
During the war of drugs, the opioid crisis happened, and in a way is still happening.
Last October, we declared the opioid crisis a public health emergency. Should have been done a long time before.
The opioid epidemic in the US is complicated, but to simplify it, it started when drug companies pushed doctors to give out strong painkillers like OxyContin to everyone, telling them the pills weren't addictive. Spoiler alert, they were. This led to many people getting hooked on the pills, and when they couldn't get or afford more pills, some turned to dangerous street drugs.
And I was addicted to painkillers. And when the painkillers got too expensive, I switched to heroin.
These street drugs are often strong and mixed with other harmful stuff, causing many people to die from overdoses. Some people even turn to crime to pay for their drug habit. And over the past 2 decades, the United States has experienced a growing crisis of substance abuse and addiction. It's illustrated best by the rise in deaths from drug overdoses. And in the past 20 years, overdose deaths in the US have multiplied nearly 6 times. The vast majority of these deaths involved some form of opioids. And after almost 50 years, the US has spent more than $1 trillion on the war on drugs. And even still, all numbers of drug abuse are up. So that brings me to the following conclusion. The war on drugs in this form will never be won. Drug use and overdose deaths are ever on the rise. And drug-related crime has only increased. But that doesn't mean the war on drugs is lost in its entirety. There are countries that are successful in turning the numbers of drug users around. Look at countries like Switzerland or the Netherlands. Switzerland introduced a program where individuals with severe heroin addiction could receive medically supervised doses of heroin. This approach has drastically reduced overdose deaths, improved health outcomes for addicts, and decreased drug-related crime. The program has been seen as a model for harm reduction strategies. And the Netherlands is known for its tolerance of the sale of cannabis in licensed coffee shops, while still maintaining strict controls on other drugs. This approach has kept drug use rates relatively low, minimized the criminal market, and gives law enforcement the possibility to focus on more serious crimes. So maybe it's time for a change of approach. Maybe there's still a way to win this war. But for now, all we can do is don't use drugs.
Start some things you just can't stop, and drugs are like that too. You pick it up, it's hard to drop, and drugs are like that too. A baby goes